And let's just hear from you, if you don't mind, in the chat box, or you can pop on something you recall from last time, which helps me to understand where we're at, what stuck with you, or what do you remember just for review purposes, or questions. Anybody feel courageous, want to be the one to jump in? Well, I remember lots of things because I was trying to make little marketing clips for my TikTok out of last week's video. So I know everything we talked about. Ooh, the definition of rapport. Yes, the definition, we talked a lot about rapport is based on vulnerability, actually. Did that ring true for y'all? Rang true for me as I heard myself say it again. And then we had the sharing from the radiant heart. Beautiful, love it. What else? Self-regulation techniques. Oh, so crucial. I wish someone would have taught me those a long time before they did. Cool. Anything else that we remember from last time? We had the 3 keys. Do you remember any of those keys stand out for you? We got a couple of them in here. We got like all but number 3. So self-regulation was in what's it called? Finding the inner resource. And then we had the radiant heart was number 2, sharing from your radiant heart. And the number 3 is going to feature prominently in tonight's class, which is emphasizing choice and empowerment, emphasizing choice and empowerment. Cool. So we are all reviewed and it is time to dive in. So tonight's class, your overview is we're going to take those 3 keys that we introduced last time. And last time was heavy on the key of finding the inner resource, because the other 2 are really based on that. And we're going to work on applying those keys to difference or conflict. And one of the things about this is, last week's class may have seemed a little general. I know that's the feeling I walked away having taught the class, was that's a little general. And it's because usually where we need these keys the most is in conflict. So that's tonight, hopefully some of these pieces will get a lot more specific. And then what's cool is, even though we're talking about conflict, everything we learn, again, applies to all kinds of relationships, whether it's your best friend who you never really have conflict with, or your spicy spouse who you always have conflict with, but that's why it's so sexy at your house, or whatever. All the same principles apply. So these are ways to work with those 3 keys. And then final week, next week, start thinking about some specific situations that you would like to hone in on, because next week I don't have too much of a pre-scripted curriculum. I actually want to hear from you. What are some issues that are real in your life? And then we can actually kind of dig into those and see how these keys apply to real life issues. So, sound like fun? Give me an emoji and let me know. All right, cool. Or live action emojis are, of course, welcome. Cool. What does Buddy think? Buddy looks relaxed. Okay, so good. At least I've created a safe space for one of us. That makes me happy. All right, well, let's do just a little practice. We're going to do some inner resource practice. Find a comfortable position. Very short meditation, inner resource practice. Now, if you really want to be meditating, put the top of your head right over your pelvic floor and just align with gravity. But you could also just lean back in your chair or even lie down on the floor, whatever you like the best. Let's do a couple rounds of our 2-1 breathing. So your inhale, if it's 4, your exhale is going to be 8. And similarly, if your inhale was 3, your exhale would be 6. So exhaling twice as long as the inhale. We'll do our resourcing with a nature image or a power spot. So imagining a place in nature that's sacred to you. Imagining it as just right. Temperature is just right for you. The time of day is just right for you. And imagine that you are sitting in and practicing in your sacred place. Feel how that feels in your body, as if you're being infused by the energies of that sacred place. And then take the opportunity to savor that sensation. Anything enjoyable about that, really smile to and be grateful for, and foreground that part with your awareness. And then taking our hands, and we'll place the hands over the heart, if that's comfortable for you, of course. And we just imagine that these are like magic Reiki hands, and that they're pouring into you whatever kind of emotional qualities that you might long for. Feel free to keep those hands on your heart, or you can take any mudra with your posture that feels supportive to you in this way. So you might take the self hug, and just imagine that you're being hugged by whatever kind of hug you want the most. Conceivably, you could even take, I'll tell you in a minute another posture we can do, but do yours right now. Like you're being bathed in whatever qualities you're longing for. Okay, then if your eyes were closed, unless you really don't want to, open them so you can see the next practice, which is we're going to do a posture practice, which is Wonder Woman pose. So you put your hands on your hips. You can stand if you want. I'm going to stay seated to be on camera. You can stay seated. And then you kind of puff up your chest. You look up on the 45. You smile. And now you're not going to do those 2-1 breaths. You're going to emphasize your inhale. You're not going to make it too much longer, but you kind of puff up your chest. And just think of, for the time of this class, what values do you want to bring to this space we're creating? Do you want to bring a love of learning? Do you want to bring care and gentleness for yourself? Do you want to bring a feisty rebel? Do you want to bring a supportive, hype person who backs up everything I say with thumbs up emojis? What do you want to bring? What are your values that you're expressing in this place? And then just before this posture gets tiring, how are you going to choose to do those? What kind of actions can you take from this place of your values, acting on behalf of your values in the space of this class tonight? Okay, and letting that posture go. And one more that we can use, if we're going to talk about conflict, we should talk about how to snap ourselves the hell out of trauma if we get traumatized by being in conflict or by something that I say. So take your left hand and shake it. And take your right hand and shake it. Oh, let's put the left hand down. Why not? You know. All right, take your 2 hands and shake them. Can you get a leg to come up and shake? Oh, sound effects are optional, but they actually help. All right, what about the other leg? Does that one do it? I don't care. Just do what feels good. What about your arms and your legs? And then you have to sing, if I were a rich man. We have a Qigong exercise like this, and Sifu always called it the fiddler on the roof exercise. Okay, and the last one we'll do from the Tibetan tradition is you take a big inhale, and then your whole body is going to go and shake out as you exhale. So let's try it. Inhale, and then 2 and 3. Good. Inhale up with your arms. Exhale and sigh it down. 2. And 3. All right, so there we are, just some really nice resourcing and self-regulation practices for us that we're going to use throughout these principles. Okay, so this wasn't in my curriculum, but I'm just going to go off the cuff for a second, which is this yogic teaching that the perfect partner exists. Everything you ever wanted in relationship exists. And then they say the punchline and they say, it's you. So this is this classic teaching on the inner resource. Like we said last week, I got a hair in my face. Hang on one second. There we go. I really tried to emphasize the tightrope of that we don't want to say, yeah, just go into a cave and renounce all your relationships and don't go to therapy because no, that's not what the inner resource means. But what it does mean is that if we have this sort of outward seeking in yogic contemplative traditions, they call it like grasping. If we have that orientation toward our relationships, we're setting ourselves up for dissatisfaction. And as we'll mention tonight, there's some really good research that shows if you come to the relationship with starting from dissatisfaction, you're setting the thing up for failure. So the idea of all these practices, like if you put a emoji thing or your picture or whatever, if you felt some moment of goodness or ease in one of those inner resource practices that we just did, any calm or warmth or anything like that. Yeah, so the idea that they're trying to present is if you can do that, that's where we start to rest. And we move ourselves back from trying to get people to do that for us, right? We take responsibility for that aspect of our resourcing. So it doesn't mean you become, tonight we're going to really emphasize, it doesn't mean you become a pushover. It doesn't mean that you don't state your needs. We're actually going to be stating our needs more explicitly, more potently than ever before, but we're not coming to the relationship assuming that another person could or should resource us. In yogic contemplative traditions, they would say, even if your therapist or your mom or your best friend seemed to resource you, the only power they actually have is to point to your inner resource. And have you ever experienced this with your therapist or with your Qigong master or something like that? You have these moments, they're like, well, have you considered blah, 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 blah? And you're like, oh man, you just put me at ease for 3 weeks. How'd you do that? You're magic. And then if you found a good one, they'll go, actually, you're magic. I just directed your attention to something that's part of you, right? You're with a toxic narcissist if you go, you're magic, and they go, I know. Thanks, stick around, kid, you'll never find anyone like me. So this is what we mean by that inner resource of finding that true love within, not making that something that someday, somehow, I don't know when, I don't know how. I didn't know we were going Little Mermaid tonight. Out there, but that's the place we start from. And then all the aspects of our relationship, what's really cool, they say conflict and the best night of cocktails with your buddy ever, and hot sex and silent meditation retreats, and the whole spectrum, they become ornaments of that inner resource rather than a constant sort of seeking for that thing which is endogenous to us. So that was last week. That was last week wrapped up in a nutshell. Let's get into conflict. Are you ready? Okay, he doesn't know if he's ready. Put in the chat box if you would, please. Online education, you got to help me out here. Otherwise it's awkward. Put in the chat box. What's your least favorite aspect of conflict? What's your least favorite aspect of conflict? Put it in the chat box if you don't mind while I look at my notes. Tell you what I'm supposed to tell you. Oh man, that's a lot of notes. I better not do all that. We'll have to talk really fast. That's annoying. Fear. Yeah, fear is an uncomfortable part of conflict. What's your least favorite? Feeling misunderstood and disempowered. Yes, I'm with you there. My nervous system thinking that I'm going to die. Totally, totally. Misunderstanding. Yeah, it's so uncomfortable. It can be so uncomfortable. Unease and losing control. Yeah. Let me see if there's any more coming through before I go on. You got to give, this is what I've learned over the last 21 months or whatever. You got to give people time to type. Okay. So then how relatable are these other ones aside from the one that you shared? Are those other ones relatable too? Can we relate to, worst thing about conflict is like I hear that and I go like, oh yeah, that's when like you go through, you put all the energy into like arguing your side, trying to hear their side, and then you still come away and you're no closer to understanding each other or being understood, right? Conflict, like I relate to what Jim shared of like, if I get that text, can we talk? Just total fear. Like it's just a total cortisol response in my system. It may be different for you all, but that one does it for me. You know, the sense that, oh, where was it? Where was it? I loved this one. Yeah. The nervous system thinking I'm going to die, right? Sometimes maybe you haven't labeled it that way, but that's actually what your nervous system does a little, like when it's like conflict, when, you know, the ones like, that's why it feels so bad, is because your nervous system thinks your life is threatened and it responds accordingly. So, what was this one? I just missed one here. Oh, how it shuts down communication. Isn't that a bummer? Like it doesn't have to, but usually the lion's share of the conflicts I've been in, they tend to, it's the volume gets louder and the communication decreases. Get that text and then thinking the other party has returned. Yeah. So conflict, super important. What I want to point you to, did anyone like me, when you hear other people's experience, like when I say something like, what's the worst thing about conflict? And it's like, oh, this fear and that fear. Does anyone like me, something actually gets freed up inside just hearing other people share the same experience as you? Does anybody feel that? How like, you know, if we were in a classroom together, I mean, I actually feel it now online, but I might just be like a chi hippie. You know, but a lot of time when I do this, when we're in a classroom together, you can kind of like feel the energy in the atmosphere of the room just gets like, oh yeah, now we can do something. Oh, here we are together. So I want you to try to catch that feeling if you had it now, or if you can remember that, like you were in, I don't know, you went to the, you know, the body workers conference or the therapists conference or the somatic experiencing conference, you know, and somebody told a joke about this common humanity. And all of a sudden the whole room was like, oh yeah. And then you could just feel, oh, we're all here together. I get it, right? There's this loosening, and it actually can happen around some of our most difficult experiences. There's a type of bliss of experiencing our common humanity that can happen almost only when we ask questions like, what's the worst thing about conflict? And we can use that actually as a portal into feeling each other's hearts more deeply than we did a minute ago. It's really quite interesting. And so this leads us into the main slogan, the takeaway that I want you, if you boil down whatever rants I happen to go on, I can't go on too many because it's a short class, but whatever rants I happen to go on, if you want to boil it down, the slogan is, borrowed from my llama, meet from our sameness, learn from our differences. Meet from our sameness and learn from our differences. So what this allows us to do, we're going to talk about a couple of amazing things, but this is a little mantra that's going to allow us to come from inner resource and elicit inner resource from the other person. This is a mantra. So if you're taking notes, what's the slogan? Meet from our sameness, learn from our differences. Why? What does the mantra, what deity does that invoke? Oh, that invokes the deity of coming from inner resource and eliciting inner resource in your buddy, in your conflict partner, in your sacred Aikido conversation relationship. Okay, in this slogan, what you can learn is why most of that other stuff happens that we don't like so much about conflict. Because usually, let's think back and see if this is true. Usually, when a conflict goes sideways, it's because we did it backwards. This is the theme for this whole class, right? If you want good relationships, just do it backwards. So, when conflict goes sideways, we try to meet from our differences, or you could say we foreground our differences, and then we don't even do anything with our samenesses. Like we end up the same. We both end up mad, sad, or confused, right? But when you foreground difference, it's very hard to get to the sameness or to get to the underlying unity, right? So last week we introduced the red, yellow, green light. Does anybody remember that from last week? Okay, red, yellow, green light. And I said, like, okay, look, if you can't find inner resource, go in the other room, right? It's not actually great, despite what some of us have been taught, to train our brain to stay in upset. We actually want to train our brain to pop out of upset, snap forward into our prefrontal cortex and out of the limbic system, and then come back to relating from there if we can. So that red light tends to be what happens, you can probably remember, when conflict goes south. And okay, so just a show of hands or emojis. It's under the reactions button in case you don't know where they are. Oh, there's one. Oh, look, there's some little hands. Or you can just wave with your actual picture on there. Can you remember a time when you were otherwise in a wonderful relationship with someone, like a relationship characterized by rapport or attraction or love or whatever, and then you got into that one argument? And do you remember that feeling where at the end of the argument, you can almost feel like, whoa, I don't know, like, you got to be careful not to believe your mind, because the mind almost says like in the body, it feels like, wow, I don't understand how I was ever attracted to you. Or how the hell did like we get here? Like it's almost impossible to feel rapport for that other person. Has anyone ever had an experience like this type of conflict, right? It could be with your dad, right? It could be with a spouse. And those are the most tragic to me. And thank God I learned about the amygdala hijack, right? Because sometimes like not as much anymore because the training works. That's not an ego statement. That's actually an evidence-based statement. But so like not very much anymore, but occasionally for a minute that'll come up, like in my sacred, beautiful relationship with my partner of many years now, and we'll kind of like, oh, we'll have fallen into a fight. And for a minute, it's like, oh God, can we even do this? It's like, of course we can do this. We've been at it for decades now, but for a minute, that little limbic system totally takes over and overrides the system. That is bound to happen. What I propose to you, that's bound to happen if you start from difference. If you start from difference, it's bound to get to the point, unless you take a yellow light, you take a red light, right? It's bound to get to the point where we lose the feeling of sameness. That rapport, the vulnerability, comes from sensing our common humanity. And when we start with difference, it's pretty much inevitable, unless someone has a saintly moment, or unless you take a pause, or if you have a marriage and family therapist who, what their job a lot of time is they just re-emphasize common humanity. Can you see how she's just asking for this? And that's actually the same thing you want. Oh, but unless you've got that, the spiral goes down. If you start with difference and emphasize difference above all, the spiral devolves to where it's nearly impossible. In the worst cases, it's physically impossible to have the felt sense of our common humanity. Okay, does that make sense to y'all? Am I talking sense or nonsense? Feel free to put a chat in or ask a question. We could even do a live question now if you have one. Did I see a hand? No, just a thumbs up. Okay, cool. So, all right, good. So this is actually principle number one. The meeting from our sameness, the sameness is our inner resource when we're speaking first person. And then intersubjectively, we could call inner resource common humanity. We could call inner resource common humanity, right? Like when we do this exercise, we put our hands on our heart, and like, oh, feel like you're receiving whatever it is you want the most. That's common to all humans. Like even, how do you do it without name calling? But like even like terrible humans, like most of us would agree, they want safety. They're being terrible to try to get safety or freedom or power or bliss. We all want the same stuff. And when we can recognize that, it actually keeps us from dehumanizing ourselves by dehumanizing others. So meeting from our sameness is how we apply principle number one, finding the inner resource. And like I said, this is a mantra to come from inner resource and elicit inner resource from the other. Okay, what is this about eliciting inner resource? So this is kind of like point 1A. Well, I always tell people about research from the Gottman Institute because I love to name drop the Gottman Institute. Follow them on Instagram. Like they just have like little infographics that you can see, and it's great. But Gottman Institute, John Gottman's research was the first kind of to do this, where they took high-speed cameras, they had couples sit down and talk about a mildly troubling issue in their relationship. And they watched how many micro expressions of contempt or disgust happened during that conversation. And they found they could predict with like, I think it's 90% accuracy, the rate of divorce within 5 years, based on how often people gave these micro expressions of contempt or disgust. That's a real interesting marker to what makes a relationship feel good. So like in this case, we're talking about marriage, right? And how do you make a marriage feel good? Well, what their research shows is if you start from like the type of difference that snaps us into our limbic system, then what you're going to do is you actually elicit that from the other person, right? So if you haven't elicited inner resource, and you're in a, well, if I'm just mad enough, I can get them to do such and such, or maybe you're in a learned helplessness, screw them, I can't, they'll never change, whatever. That actually, in this case, they're tracking it through micro expressions. You might believe there's a subtle energy, it might be pheromones, I don't know, but for whatever reason, our state of inner resource is going to elicit a mirror from the other person. In many cases. Now, of course, you still should be on guard against narcissist gaslighter types who will say, no, I'm acting this way because of you. No, that's not how this works. So we're not going that far, but we are saying, all else equal, you're with your buddy. If you bring inner resource, you are likely to elicit inner resource from them. Your partner's having a hard day. If that destabilizes you, it's likely not going to help them. But if you can gas up your inner resource, a lot of time you're this great, beautiful, stable thing, and they will likely return the favor later. So meeting from our sameness, learning from our differences. Let me check my notes. Write any questions in the chat box if you need to. So we're going to try to signal, instead of contempt or disgust, like that's the worst. We're actually going to try to signal openness, compassion, and curiosity. Okay, there are all sorts of advanced practices in conflict, right? We do a whole module in the Empathy Dojo on boundaries, because it's so like there's so many options of where that conversation can go. But as a general rule, if we can come with a commitment to openness, curiosity, and compassion, we're going to be eliciting that inner resource from another. Okay. Now, what else am I supposed to tell you? Yes. Okay, so the second piece is, we're in 1C, So 1C is, in this, we're going to be moving from the orientation of who's right into the orientation of sharing from the heart. So this isn't just another slogan you can use. This is borrowed from Dr. Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, of moving from who's right to sharing from the heart. What this slogan is meant to undermine is actually going to get us to principle number 3. So I'm saying this is 1C, but we're also going to principle number 3. That was foregrounding choice and empowerment. We have to go to principle number 3 first. Why am I not going in order? That's really annoying. I don't know. Does that annoy anybody but me? That I didn't go 1, 2. I went 1, 1, 1B, 1C, 3. That's pretty annoying, but I'm doing it for a reason. Okay, I'm not just doing this to toy with your feelings. We have to go to 3, to emphasizing choice, so that we don't feel like we're becoming so open-minded that our brains just fall out. And we're becoming so compassionate that we become a pushover. That's not the idea of orienting from curiosity, compassion, and openness. That's not the idea. So we have to re-emphasize choice. Choice is going to help us navigate the who's right conversation. Okay, so your second slogan is move from who's right to sharing from the heart. What does this overcome? Well, the first one, the inner resource, overcomes our tendency to snap into that limbic system and then make enemies and respond out of stress, instead of remembering that, like, we love this person, or I'm committed to communicating in this way, or I want to state my views without alienating someone else, right? So we got to have an inner resource to do that. Now, if we want to go to choice, moving out of who's right, understanding where who's right comes from is really important. When we meet from differences, our focus tends to shift, instead of from sharing and learning to winning. Our focus tends to shift from sharing and learning to winning. I don't know why I made this little pointer here, thermometer, but I really like it. So I'm just making this mudra over and over, excuse me. So if we meet from our samenesses, usually we can orient from sharing. When we meet from our differences, these are just little magic words that configure our brain. I don't know if you knew your brain works that way, but there's a whole science of cognitive biases. You can use little words to prime how your brain's going to approach a situation. It's super weird. So just like Loki and Odin and the Wizard of Earthsea taught us. So we want to orient from sameness, and then instead of winning, we're into sharing. Well, why do we want to win? It actually comes from the way Homo sapiens, our species, developed. We tend to look for a social pecking order. It's part of what we look for. And what that means is who gets to tell who what to do. Primates, like Homo sapiens, look for a social pecking order, and that means who gets to tell who what to do. Okay, these two aspects. One, your limbic system that takes over your brain and says, no, you're not having a discussion with your spouse about where to go to dinner. This is a life and death struggle, treat it as such. Okay, that's one outdated circuitry for our current situation. And then the second one says, oh, this isn't my best friend telling me why they won't vote for Bernie Sanders. This is determining who gets to be in the top of the social pecking order and tell who what to do. And it's just this weird primate default that we go into. So we'll tend to go into conversations looking for who's right. Just like last week, we talked about the negativity bias, right? So it's this next thing. And if you have key number 3, emphasizing choice and empowerment, we can start to subsume, we can start to get around that ancient neural architecture that says, look for the pecking order, figure out which one of you has won and gets to tell the other one what to do by strength of arms or whatever. And we can actually move towards something that's more accurate to the situation we find ourselves in, which is sovereignty and consent. sovereignty, and consent. So how we bring number 3 is that we're not coming to the conversation to with the purpose solely. If you want, now you can try this out. I think you're probably in this class because you've tried all these other strategies enough. So if you want the Buddhist key to a better relationships, don't come to your conversation with the goal of bringing over the other person to your point of view. Even when that's a good idea, like let's say someone is spouting hateful rhetoric. There's a lot of research on this now, more than ever, because there's more hateful rhetoric on with the wireless speeds are faster than ever. So we got more hateful rhetoric than ever. And the worst way to get a person to soften up their hateful rhetoric is to try to convince them otherwise. So even if it was like lives were at stake, unless you convince this other person, when you come in, well, if we think about it, it's because you've lost the inner resource at that point. You've put your center out there, unless I get them to change, and you elicit that from the other person. It really does mirror that way. So the more you come in, like, let's figure out who's right, and it's going to be me, and I'm going to tell you that you have to get vaccinated, or you can't say that on the internet, or you got to do this. What kind of response do you get? Even a little softer than that. Mom, you have to start doing Tai Chi. The minute you come with have to, you know mom's never going to do the Tai Chi, right? So it really behooves us, that's a word I never use, I'll use it with my new mudra, it really behooves us to try to move from who's right to sharing, because in sharing is actually where you have the greatest power to influence another. It's super cool. And this is so totally mystical. Don't go on a tangent. It's totally part of these yogic traditions that if you want the most power and influence, stop trying to freaking control everything. I know, what? But this is the flip it backwards. This is the first line of Master Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Yogaschitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is stopping the way the mind flips things, vritti, backwards. Tao Te Ching, the movement of the Tao is reversal. So we take what's common sense to our Homo sapiens defaults, which are great if, something jumps out from the corner, right? And you got to like respond quickly. That's great. But all the situations, all the really wicked problems that face us today require a totally upgraded circuitry, which we have in our prefrontal cortex, but we don't usually activate. So these are your slogans to activate it. Number 1, meet from our sameness, learn from our differences. Well, how do we do that? Okay, inner resource, eliciting the thing, whatever. And then as we start to emphasize choice, we're going to move from who's right to sharing, right? So you're going into this conversation with that open-hearted because you are still a sovereign being, and you're requiring consent from the other person. So if I'm going to say you're going to require anything from them, that I will actually say, no, their consent is required, parentheses, in order to stay in relationship, because otherwise you're not in a relationship. You're in a fight. You're in a sovereignty battle. You're in a monkey primate hierarchy battle, right? If you're in a relationship, it's enthusiastic mutual consent. And this is how you can have sovereign beings creating a greater unity out of their diversity, meeting from our sameness. And in this case, that might be a sameness that we're aspiring toward, and learning from our differences. So you got to know that you still get to choose as you listen, oh, come to Thanksgiving, have the turkey. Mom, I'm a vegetarian. That's my ethical choice, right? How the heck are you going to come in with inner resource and let's share what's alive with it when they're trying to change your opinion? Well, if at the end of the day, you can still go, thank you for telling me all of this, Mom. I'm still choosing to bring my own dish to Thanksgiving, and I'm not eating the turkey, but I love you. And you got to know that that's your option, because when you do, then you can hear everything else. It's not that you're not laying trips on them. You haven't come to the conversation to try to win them over and gain the power of who gets to tell who what to do. And you're also not allowing any of that from the other side. So that's why 3 has to come first, because we might get confused. inner resource, open up your heart. And we might think like, oh, wow, so be a sacred pushover. No, you got to know at the end of the day, your choice is your choice. But when you have that, you can open up as big as the sky because you're in the center. Okay, should we do number 2 before we finish up? Okay, number 2. We got 1, 3, and 2. We'll make it quick and we'll do it more next week. In every conflict and also every other moment of relationship, 4 things are included. 1 is the person's perspective. 2 is their emotions. 3 are the values or needs. And 4 is their strategy. So you and your sacred Aikido of conflict partner will be bringing all 4 of these. Have you noticed that usually when conflict really sucks, it's because you're like, hey, here's my perspective. And then they go like, that's not the perspective. Here's the perspective. And then they share their perspective as if it was the perspective, right? And then you go like, okay, well, here's what I think we should do about it. And they go, that's not what we should do about it. Here's what we should do about it. And these 2 are our differences. Our perspectives are going to be different in conflict. Our strategies are going to be different in conflict. For goodness sakes, don't vote for Joe Biden. He's a tool of the system. And isn't that shown by blah, 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 blah. So I'm not going to vote or whatever, right? Okay. And then you might, if your thing was last Thanksgiving was the opposite of that, and you're like, no way, are you telling me this and this and this because of this? Okay, you got different strategies. Then that's going to be supported by your different perspectives. Well, I see it this way. I see it this way. I see it this way. And the other side also has their thing. Sometimes even too, because memory is selective, like when couples fight, they have a totally different narrative about an event that happened 10 minutes ago, right? And memory is, they might be both correct, but selecting different aspects of those memories. And then we also, as humans, we hallucinate aspects of memories. Ugh. Here's the trick. Because those are on the outside of the sandwich, you can think of it like, it's the wrapper, right? It's the shell. So you run into it first. And if you go on default, you're going to meet from your differences, right? Because we tend to share first. And this is part of the thing is that we don't want to be vulnerable. And so we say, this is how I see the story, and this is what I think we should do about it. And rarely do we say, because I'm scared. I'm scared if you elect Joe Biden, then we're going to get more of the same. And didn't you see what happened when Obama said change, and then the Iraq war, and then blah, 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 and the bank bailouts, and then the CEOs got their vacation. Like, man, that's a conversation I really love to have with people. But the thing about, but you can't because of this, that always sucks if it's a different perspective than mine. So you can't bite the hook. Maybe this can be your slogan for number 2 is don't bite the hook. And the hook is going to lead you to, I'm mixing my metaphors, I'll clean it up by next week, is going to lead you to eat the wrapper or try to chew the shell. And if we got into what are the emotions that are present, I'm scared. What are the values or the needs? Well, why are you scared? Because I want us to be able to come together as a country in this hypothetical example and share our common humanity. And I don't see any of the talking heads leading us in that. That part is juicy and it's vulnerable to share. But if you get that, that's the nourishing stuff in the middle, and it's not the wrapper on the outside. Don't take the bait. Yeah, the bait is our differences. And we don't know that we're baiting each other. Like all of this stuff is going on under the radar. And then we wonder why conflict sucks so bad. There are people out there, not ones who love conflict because they love to fight, but there are some people who love conflict because their brain goes, oh man, we're about to really connect. We're about to really get to the heart of things. I am not, let me be honest, I am not one of those people, but I aspire to be one. Because if we knew that underneath that wrapper, like the minute someone gives us that wrapper, right underneath are all of those juicy feelings and needs, which are our common humanity. And what's really cool, if you've noticed this, if you've had a chance somehow by freaking grace, God struck you both and one person started to reveal and you felt safe enough to get vulnerable and it actually like worked and elicited, that's the most nourishing thing in the universe. That type of unguarded sharing is the most nourishing thing in the universe. The good news about the radiant heart is that we can grow ourselves and learn tactics by which it's always safe for us to share that, because we take safety in the radiance itself, not from the other person's response. We don't make our radiant heart something that's conditional. We make the radiant heart itself the goal. Well, we're in overtime. We're still kind of stacking up. I hope you like my sermon. And next week will be a bit more back and forth. So I hope you bring your back and forthy brain next week and your interactive extrovert. But this week, I hope you enjoy. We got meat from your sameness. I could have just done that as the whole class and saved you a bunch of trouble, but that's your inner resource. Then we went to number 3. You got to know it's sovereign consent from both sides. Don't lay no trips. Don't let no trips be laying upon you. And if you don't take the bait and eat the wrapper, we have a chance to both be nourished by the juicy, juicy, vulnerable stuff on the inside, which is what we all long to see and have seen. That is our common humanity. Whew. All right, that's the official end of class. I'll stick around just in case you have a really strong rebuttal or need me to lead you in shaking again if anything was triggering or traumatizing. So if you need to go right now, I salute you. Next week, bring your problems, bring your questions, and we'll tailor this stuff to them. But if you have any questions right now, lay them on me, or I'll turn off the recording, just say hi, and away we go.